All right, my apologies. We are back to another thrilling episode of Free Read Fridays. I'm your intrepid narrator, Fragath, and today we're going to continue reading Under Pressure, or The Dragon in the Sea, by Frank Herbert. Let's see, previously on, what went down? This is as much for my memory as yours. Let's see. A lot. A lot went down. They are still being pursued, presumably by the EP, which I think stands for Eastern Powers. Um, so they've taken out a bunch of subs already, probably. Um, and they were pretty much getting surrounded. And so what they had to do is they had to descend to well below the sub's rated depth. And in order to do that, they increased the air pressure on the inside to push out. Now, this means they had to change the atmosphere mix uh, and change a whole lot of things about what they're breathing in order to keep up and keep from killing themselves. Oh, hey, optical antenna. Thank you for tuning in. Hey. So that's pretty much where they're at. Oh, right. They had Sparrow had to do some repair work, which got him quite irradiated. So he's taken a very large dose of radiation at this point. Hopefully not a lethal one, but it's a lot more than they thought he had. They thought he only got a certain amount, which would be fine. He'd be recovering for like a day or two. But now he's gotten like 10 times that or more. And that's not good. Uh, it's still probably survivable, or so they've indicated, but it's not great. So he's going to be out for a while. He's still up and about, though, because he's relentless. Sparrow is just a determinator. He just keeps on going uh, because he feels he has no choice, and he has faith that he can keep doing it. The F word, faith, is one you will hear quite a bit. Have already heard quite a bit. Okay. Yeah, okay. I've got bracketed out what I'll be reading for today. It's about just about 30 pages, maybe a little more. A little less, actually. One page less than 30. Um, and that will get me very nicely at part up to part 3. So not a super long one today, probably another hour and a half, I would guess. Um, yeah, that'll get us nicely up to part 3, and then one, maybe 2 streams after that, and we'll have the book done. Yeah, probably 2, unless it's a really long one, because that's quite a few pages. That's what, 60 pages. So yeah, 2 streams probably. So yeah, 3 more streams, including this one, and we'll have this book done. Then I'm thinking an episode of short stories. Maybe I wind up doing, oh, what's that? There's one more short story collection by Gregg Egan I haven't gotten to on this stream. Is that instantiation? Instantiation? I don't actually know what that's pronounced. I don't think I've ever heard the word spoken aloud. Or is there another one? Oh, there's also Oceanic. I don't think I've done Oceanic. So I've got like 2 more short story collections by Gregg Egan to do on stream. Um, if you hear clattering, it's because I'm rolling my chair over to look at my bookshelf. I'd be like, what is that? I can't see that one. It's hidden behind another volume. Because that's just how we do here. This is how you say a very fly-by-night operation. We're not exactly professionals here. All right, so without further ado, I'm going to get another sip of scaldingly hot tea, and we'll get banging it out. We'll get... I'll hopefully say words that make sense. Let's go with that. Chapter 10. What's wrong with Les? Sparrow stood in the aft door, gaze sweeping over the control deck. He stepped through the door as Ramsey turned. Take it slow, said Ramsey. Ooh. Sparrow hesitated in mid-stride. Ramsey bent over Bonnet, again checked his vampire gauge, compared it with the one on his own wrist. No change. Too soon. He said, I've just formed the Ramsey theory on why some chimpanzees died and some didn't. Sparrow again moved forward, bent over Bonnet. What chimpanzees? The chimps med. What? Oh, med 1. I was really confused. Uh, the chimps med 1 put under 400 pounds with pecan hydrase. My advice is for you not to overexert. Get excited, nervous, or... I know about the chimps, said Sparrow. Do you think... He hesitated. Some kind of glandular upset. Some kind of glandular upset, said Ramsey. What's more likely than an emotional trigger, maybe coupled to physical activity? Sparrow nodded. Ramsey noted the vampire gauge needles sinking toward normal. He began massaging Bonnet's left arm. You're okay, Les. Just relax and take it easy. The crisis is over. Take it easy. Take it easy. Take it easy. Bonnet's head rocked groggily. We have to avoid excitement, said Ramsey. Our bodies are walking a tight wire down here, an uneasy balance. Sparrow stood up, went to the search board. I gave Joe a sedative. He was crying, raving. Maybe I... He fell silent. Bonnet opened his eyes. Remain calm, said Ramsey. Do you hear me, Les? The first officer nodded. There's no danger if you relax. You can't force a man to relax, said Sparrow. Ramsey reached around Bonnet's head, found the nerve line on the back of his neck, massaged it. You're feeling better already. Bonnet wet his lips with his tongue. Okay, get back to your board. Breathe slow and easy, said Ramsey. He stood up. Bonnet swallowed, spoke as though past a thickened tongue. It was like quicksand. Feeling better now. Ramsey turned toward Sparrow. He'll be okay now. Sparrow glanced down at Bonnet. Stay where you are, Les, until you feel like getting up. He turned to Ramsey. I've been on the eyes. The current has pulled our tow to a 45-degree angle across our stern. If we slack off the top tow line, we'll right, but that might free the tow for a further shift. Best leave well enough alone, said Ramsey. How near the edge of this seamount are we? The eyes don't show it. Maybe 75 yards. For the tow, that is. We were angling away from the edge when we sat down. Sparrow looked at the ranging computers. Intermittent signal near extreme range. That cold layer is waving over us like a fan, said Ramsey. Sparrow backed away from the board, looked around him, brought his attention back to Ramsey. There was something in the way he looked at Ramsey of the same attention he gave to his boat's instruments. What's this Long John business? Joe doesn't make sense. Ramsey repeated what he had told Bonnet. Did the ram benefit from this acquisition propensity of yours? Not this trip, Skipper. Sparrow glanced upward to the row of reactor room telltales. Maybe next trip. Bonnet spoke from his position on the deck. We're gonna have a next trip too, if we don't crack up like poor Hap. We won't, said Sparrow. Bonnet heaved himself to his feet. I'm glad we have God's word on that. Sparrow gave him a searching stare, said, I'm reassuming command, Les. The circumstances warrant it. I'm in no immediate danger from that radiation overage. Of course, Skipper. There seemed a sigh of relief in Bonnet's voice. Sparrow said, I'm going back now, and have another clear look at Joe. I'm leaving Johnny on the search board. All clear? All clear, Skipper. Oh, wait. All clear, Skipper. Sparrow turned his angular form slowly, went out the aft door. He's an automaton, said Ramsay, addressing the empty air where Sparrow had stood. He's under more pressure than the submarine, said Bonnet. He took a deep breath. Let's you pay attention to that board. Ramsay frowned, returned his attention to his gauges and dials. Silence hung between them. Presently, Bonnet said, Thanks, Johnny. Maybe you saved my life. Ramsay shrugged, remained silent. I heard what you told the skipper. It feels right. Come to think of it, maybe you saved all of our lives. Be damned lonesome down here all alone, said Ramsay. You'd probably prefer 3 well-stacked blondes, said Bonnet. Come to think of it, that'd get my vote, too. Another signal at outer range, said Ramsay. 6 subs in net search spacing. They'll pass out of range in the southeast quadrant. They just ain't looking where nobody could possibly be, said Bonnet. Can't say that I blame them. I still don't believe I'm here. He glanced up at the static pressure gauge, looked quickly away. No need for 2 of us here, said Ramsay. Nothing except the skipper's double team orders. Stupid orders, said Ramsay. Take it easy, lad, said Bonnet. You can't fight the Navy chain of command, and you can't fight God. He shrugged. And when the 2 of them are on the same team... What makes you believe that nonsense? Asked Ramsay. Bonnet froze. I make jokes, boy. That's one thing. What you just said is another thing. He shook his head. I've been 40 missions with the savvy Sparrow guy. Don't talk to me about nonsense. I know what I've seen. And you know what you want to believe, thought Ramsay. Somewhere a faint dripping caught his attention. Condensation on the pipes. The ram suddenly assumed a cold, empty feeling around him. We're not going to make it, he thought. 1,000 alert enemy subs ranging across our track. It was crazy to send us out. A desperation move. The lights of his thermocouple monitor winked blindly on the instrument board. God's cold cloak waving over us. Maybe that's the best thing to believe. Knowledge is the course of our lives. We eat the apple and we learn just enough to make us afraid. The ram shuddered briefly as the current tugged at her toe. The deck tilted back toward level. If we raise a big mud patch on the surface, stirring up the bottom like a mud pie, they'll spot it, said Bonnet. They'll have a sky full of buzzards this close to their own shores. How'll they see it in the fog? Asked Ramsay. He felt a sudden lightening of his spirits. Fog topside? How can you tell? Skipper arranged it with God, said Ramsay. You think you're joking, said Bonnet. He looked at Ramsay. You do, don't you? Ramsay reset the ranging computer in front of him. A man has to live with his boat, be a part of it, he said, speaking lightly. He felt the sudden undertow pull of thought below the words. It was like stepping outside his body and watching it function. This boat believes in God, he said. The counter hands of the time log swept around, around, around. The watches changed as the ram snuggled into the mud of the seamount. 11 days, 32 minutes from point of departure. Sparrow stood at the control board with Ramsey, sharing the last half of the electronics officer's watch. The sense of excess pressure outside their hull had become a thing he accepted. There is no he there. How long since you've heard one of their packs? Asked Sparrow. Over 6 hours. How's the tow? Ramsey checked the line telltales, switched on the stern eyes one by one. Laying to starboard about 30 degrees. Tow line's clear. Sparrow tested the drive controls, switched on the motors. A humming sense of expectancy came over the subtug. Ramsey felt it tingle through his body, starting in his feet against the deck. Let's go get that oil, said Sparrow. He threw in the drive switch, threw it off. Just to stir up the mud around us. Drop 4 waste torpedoes, Johnny. We'll need buoyancy. What about the tow? It's not carrying enough pressure to blow at this depth. We're gonna jerk it off the bottom. Pay out line until we get a good run on. Ramsey pushed down the flat black toggles which dropped the torpedoes from the waist belt. The ram bobbled upward. Sparrow again threw power into the drive. The subtug slanted upward, tow line reeling out behind them. Snub it, said Sparrow. Ramsey locked the magnetic brakes on the outside reel drums. The tug came almost to a full stop, motors straining. Slowly they struggled ahead. Line stretching, said Ramsey. That slug's in solid. Sparrow shook his head. How much more line? 800 feet, more or less. Give us some more. The ram again angled upward. Sparrow circled left, came back to the right in a snake track, barely moving. Operational depth, said Ramsey. Outside pressure, 2,994 pounds. Snub tow lines and blow number 1 tank, said Sparrow. Again Ramsey stopped the outside reels. His right hand went out to the red handle marked High Pressure Air. He set it over number 1, flicked on the safety toggle, started bleeding air into the number 1 tank. Give it everything, said Sparrow. Ramsey turned the valve 2 revolutions. Sparrow put full power into the drive. The ram's bow tipped up to almost 10 degrees. By inches they climbed, twisting soggily. She's off, said Ramsey. How's the slug's compensator system? Ramsey looked to the tow board. Following the pressure curve. Blow the slug's bow and stern tanks, said Sparrow. She's not at... Blow them anyway. Water pressure will hold the air until we reach operational depth. We're going to need all the help we can get and as soon as we can get it. Ramsey's hands moved over the tow board, carrying out his orders. They inched upward. Ramsey stared at the red dials of the slug's pressure system. Bow tanks beginning to bubble. They could feel it in the deck, a return to normal climb gradient, speed picking up. Bow tank just blew, said Ramsey. There goes the stern. He wiped perspiration from his forehead. That was the thing Les should have considered, said Sparrow. Now we know we can get off, as long as we have external weight, which we can drop for the initial buoyancy. How do you know that Les didn't... I know my shipmates, said Sparrow. Learn something from this, Johnny, and you'll make a good submariner. Never head into anything with a sub unless you have already worked out a plan for coming out the other side. Ramsey chose his words carefully. What's your plan for making the big come out on the other side? With the oil? Not just one plan, said Sparrow. I have plans for every contingency I can think of. And for some maybe I shouldn't have thought of. Like, for instance... Sparrow turned and looked full at him. Like, for instance, my crew going psychotic, one by one. Ramsey's eyes widened. The words leaped out before he could stop them. And what about yourself? Sparrow's eyes glittered. That's one of the ones maybe I shouldn't have thought of, he said. He swung back to the controls. He's like a piece of machinery, thought Ramsey. Great God in heaven, what went into making a man like that? Bonnet entered, carrying a hypodermic, its needle covered by a sterile pad. Sterile pad. "Time for your shot, Skipper." "In my left arm?" asked Sparrow. "Well, don't I get to keep any dignity?" asked Sparrow. Ramsey grinned. "I swear you guys take a perverse delight in this," growled Sparrow. "It's really too much for your arm," said Bonnet. He glanced up at the static gauge. 6,000 feet! What are we doing up here in the shallows?" Sparrow chuckled. "Okay, take my mind off my troubles." He backed away from the board. "Take over here, Johnny." Ramsey stepped into control position. Behind him, he heard Sparrow grunt. "Easy, Les." "Easy as I could, Skipper. There, have Joe check you on his watch. You seem to be coming along okay." "I should be. I've 3 nursemaids." Sparrow moved up beside Ramsey. "Hold us on course 64 degrees, 45 minutes." Ramsey turned the helm, looked up at the sonoran chart. "That'll bring us around Nordkap." He did some mental figuring, glanced at the shaft log counter. "About 26.5 hours." Sparrow looked startled. "He's good with figures," said Bonnet. "He's also too interested in where we're going to be and when," said Sparrow. "That security pap is for the birds," said Ramsey. "I wish to remind you that we found a dead man aboard this vessel, that we've been sabotaged right and left, that—" He broke off, staring at Ramsey. It was Bonnet's turn to look startled. "And now I'm in over my head," thought Ramsey. "My plan had better be right, or I won't come out the other side." Sparrow looked at the time log. "Time for Les to go on watch now." He gestured for Bonnet to take the helm. "Put us on autopilot. Steady as she goes." Ramsey went to the aft door, found Sparrow staring at him. The captain turned deliberately away, moved closer to Bonnet. "Stand by the search board as soon as we're on autopilot." "Aye, Skipper." Ramsey went out the door, swung it almost closed behind him, stood there with his ear to the crack. Bonnet said, "How's Joe?" "He's all right. He'll stand his regular watch." "What's with this Long John Ramsey? Skipper, could he be a phony?" "No doubt of it," said Sparrow. "The only question in my mind is, what kind of phony?" "Could he be a—" "He very definitely could be. Someone loaded us with spy beams and trapped that security officer." "But Ramsey wasn't aboard then." "That's what bothers me. Unless there was something wrong with the security man's timing. That would explain it." "I'll watch him, Skipper." "You do that. I'm also alerting Joe." Ramsey tiptoed away from the door. "Well, I did it," he thought. "I'd better be right." He shuddered, turned at the end of the companionway, dropped down to his cabin level. He paused in front of Garcia's cabin, looked at the blank metal of the door. Again the thought passed through his mind. "I'd better be right." He went into his cabin, closing the door softly behind him, locking it. Then he brought out the telemeter, unreeled the tapes. There was response for Sparrow's time in the tunnel repairing the pile controls, but now Sparrow was under rigid control. The wave patterns on the tapes were like the path of a rubber ball bouncing between 2 walls. "I have to be able to crack that control at will," thought Ramsey. He has to fail, just once, at the right time and at the right thing. And another part of his mind said, "That's a hell of a way to make someone well." He fought down that thought. It has to be. It's accepted practice. It works. most of the time. Sparrow's advice came back to him. Never head into anything unless you have already worked out a plan for coming out the other side. Ramsay sat down on his bunk, reset the telemeter, sealed it, slid it back beneath his desk. What if my plan doesn't work? What's my alternative for that contingency? He lay back on his bunk, staring at the rivet pattern overhead. Around him, the muted throbbing and humming of the sub-tug took on a fantasy life, as though it knew where it was going and how to get there. Ramsay fell into a troubled sleep, awoke for his next watch to find his body soaked in perspiration, a disturbing half-memory of a dream. No, a nightmare, which he could not bring to consciousness. Chapter 11. The automatic time log read 12 days, 7 hours, and 5 minutes from departure. Last half of Garcia's watch, first half of Bonnet's. The red dot on the Sonoran chart stood well into the shore off Nordkap. Shallow water with the ram creeping along the bottom in 100 fathoms. In the control room, a brightly lighted sweep of bulkhead, telltales flashing, heavy shadows on the undersides of levers and valve wheels. Wavering admonitions of dial needles. The two men bent over their work like laborers in a metal cave. Bonnet looked up to the static pressure. 260 pounds to the square inch. "What's the skipper thinking of, coming in close like this?" "Don't ask so many questions." Garcia made a minute adjustment in the bow planes, watched the depth repeater. "We're 20 feet from bottom." Sparrow ducked through the door from the aft companionway. "Anything showing on the search board?" His voice was husky with a sense of fatigue. He coughed. "Negative," said Bonnet. "This is their water," said Sparrow. "They've no shore stations along the north coast, only along the Norway reaches." "This is still awful close," said Bonnet. Again he looked to the depth gauge. "And awful shallow." "You don't think this is a safe place for us?" asked Sparrow. "No." "Good. That means they don't either. They know this is a deep tug. They're out scouring the Norwegian basin. The sill depth there is right on our known limit." "So?" "So we're going to shoot right across the shallows." He glanced at Garcia, then up to the Sonoran chart. "Course 70 degrees, Joe." Garcia swung the helm, watched the compass until they were heading true. Then he, too, looked at the chart. "Novaya Zemlya," he whispered. "We're shallow enough to start taking outside samples," said Sparrow. "Les, look for an isobaric surface running almost parallel with our course. We could use the shielding of some cold water." Bonnet pulled down a density gradient chart for the area, checked the isobaric differences, ran a siphon sample of the exterior water. "Give us 69 degrees for 5 minutes," he said. Garcia touched the helm. They watched the thermocouple repeater. Suddenly it dipped 15 degrees. "Resume course," said Sparrow. The ram returned to 70 degrees, cruising under the sheltering mask of the cold current which spilled down around them. "Steady as she goes," said Sparrow. "Push search to limit. It's a straight run from here on in." "It's Novaya Zemlya, isn't it?" asked Garcia. Sparrow hesitated. Then, "It's obvious anyway. Yes." "That's an EP rocket testing base," said Bonnet. "It'll be bristling with buzzards and snoopers." "We dug the well right under their noses," said Sparrow. If we could dig without their hearing us, we ought to be able to drain it dry undetected.
Are they tapping the reservoir too?
Sparrow grinned wolfishly, his long face glistening in the multi-hued lights of the control board. That's the beauty of it. They don't even know it's there.
Lord, whispered Bonnet, a fresh well. What are we looking for in the way of landmarks?
Again Sparrow hesitated while his eyes sought out the red dot on the Sonoran chart. It wouldn't even be a secret from the EPs if they spotted us here, he thought. Now we're in God's hands for sure. We're looking for a narrow fault fissure, he said. It's called the Gut, and it slants right up into the island shelf. You can't miss it once you range across it. Depth down to 3,600 feet and only 400 feet across.
Fissure is right, said Garcia. Do we go down into that thing?
No, it's our trail. We track it in. Again he looked at the chart. 33 hours at this rate. He turned to the aft door. Call me if anything develops. And he was gone down the companionway.
If anything develops, muttered Bonnet. We're sitting ducks. The only development we'll get is a fish in our belly. That'll wake 'em.
I think he's right, said Garcia. They're all out in the deeps looking for us. This is going to be a milk run.
I'm curdled already, said Bonnet.
He fell silent, watching the search board. The ram drove onward, headlong across the shallows like a frightened fish. The hands of the time log swept around. We're leaving Mr. Garcia on watch. Ramsey spoke as he ducked through the door into the control room. He could sense the immediate stiffening of the two men on the board, the mounting tension. Garcia made an attempt at casual banter. Look who's gone all Navy formal on us. Ramsey took up his position beside Garcia. What course? 70 degrees. Garcia surrendered the helm. Busting right across the shallows, said Ramsey. If we make this, I'm going to burn a candle to St. Cuthbert.
That's not good talk, said Bonnet.
Have you heard what the EPs have done now? Asked Ramsey. They've put engines in Novaya Zemlya. When we get close, they're going to move it right out of our way, let us go lumbering off into Siberia. Clever chaps, said Garcia. Skipper's going to run us right into an EP trap net, said Ramsey. We'll spend the rest of the war in a prison camp being brainwashed while they take the ram apart bolt by... Button your bloody lip, said Garcia. We're going to pull this one off, and when we set foot on that blessed dock, I'm going to take an obscene pleasure in pushing you...
That will be enough, said Bonnet. This is no time for fighting amongst ourselves. Bleh. This is no time for fighting among ourselves.
You wouldn't say that if you knew all about this wise guy, said Garcia. The superior brain, knows all, sees all, tells nothing.
Hit the sack, Joe, said Bonnet. That's an order.
Garcia glowered at Ramsey, turned away, went out the aft door.
What are you trying to prove, Johnny?
How do you mean?
Baiting Joe like that.
He baits easy. Bonnet stared at him.
One way to wreck a ship is to destroy crew morale, he said. There will be no more such actions from you on this cruise.
You sound like one of the old ladies of security, said Ramsey. Bonnet's face darkened.
Knock it off, Mr. Ramsey. This won't work with me.
It's already working, thought Ramsey. He said, This is going to be a really gay bunch when we get to Novaya Zemlya, all of us looking over each other's shoulders.
How do you know where we're headed? Gritted Bonnet. You weren't here when Skipper announced our destination.
I read tea leaves. Ramsey nodded toward the depth gauge graph tape. Are we looking for that? Bonnet snapped his attention back to the tape. A sharp line broke off the tape, came back on after a brief interval.
"That's a development," said Bonnet. "Buzz the skipper."
Ramsay depressed the black toggle of the number 1 call button. Shall I hold course?
"No, quarterback on. Signal!"
He slapped the button for the range computer, shut off the drive.
18 miles. Intercept course."
Ramsay whirled the helm to the right. Have they heard us?
"There's no telling," said Bonnet.
They coasted silently while he watched the pipes on his screen. Sparrow entered the control room. Signal?
"Heading 270 degrees." 270 degrees," said Bonnet.
What's the depth here?
400 feet, give or take. Or give or take a few.
You're forgetting something, said Ramsay. He pointed to the tape record of the deep fissure.
"Hide in that thing?"
Bonnet's voice rose half an octave.
"We couldn't maneuver. Straight down the alley and they'd have us bottled up."
The ram's deck began to tip to the left as they lost way. Give us headway, ordered Sparrow. Ramsay eased in the drive. He watched the pulse reader showing bottom depth below them. Abruptly, it fell off beyond the meter setting. Without being told, Ramsay brought the helm up to left until they were over the fissure. Down into it, said Sparrow.
"What if it narrows down to nothing?" asked Bonnet. "We couldn't back out without fouling our tow lines. We'll be—"
Watch your board, ordered Sparrow. The oscillations on the screen damped down, then blanked out. Full speed, said Sparrow. Down farther, Johnny. Ramsay felt the excitement gripping his stomach. The walls of this fissure are hiding our sound.
"If we hit something, we've had it," said Bonnet.
Sparrow glanced at the big static pressure gauge. 1240 pounds. Give us a pulse sweep on those walls. 5th-second intervals.
"What do you think I'm doing?" muttered Bonnet.
Sparrow grinned. He put a hand on Ramsay's shoulder. Ease her up. Speed? No, depth. Set us level. Ramsay brought up the bow planes. The ram's deck came up to level.
1 degree right,
said Bonnet. Ramsay swung the helm. We're doing 22 knots, said Sparrow. If we can just put
2 degrees right, said Bonnet.
Coax a little more speed out of her, said Sparrow. Ramsay fined down the setting of the magnometer for the induction drive. Open the silencers, said Sparrow. But Sparrow's fingers dug into Ramsay's shoulder. Do it! Ramsay's hand went out, jerked down the big red handle above the helm. They could feel the added surge of power. 28 knots, said Sparrow. There's life in the old girl yet.
2 degrees left, said Bonnet.
Ramsay complied.
"An EP subcruiser can do 45 knots, said Bonnet. "Are you trying to run away from them?"
How fast were they closing us at our last known position? Asked Sparrow.
"Estimated search speed at 20 knots, said Bonnet. "Say 45 or 50 minutes, unless they were on us and upped speed when we went out of sound. Then maybe only a half hour."
Sparrow looked at the time log. We'll count on a half hour. He waited silently.
2 degrees left, said Bonnet.
Ramsay brought the helm over, straightened them out on the new course.
"She's narrowing down," said Bonnet. "No more than 300 feet wide here."
He reset the ranging computer.
"Now it's down to 250. Here's 2 degrees left."
Ramsay swung the helm. We're all right if we don't scrape the slug off on the walls of this hole.
3 degrees right.
Ramsay obeyed.
200 feet, said Bonnet. Minus 185, 200, 215, 2 degrees right.
The ram tipped to the rudder response. Give us the silencer panes, said Sparrow. Ramsay pushed up the big red handle. They could feel the drag. Half speed, said Sparrow.
How far to the canyon rim? I can only guess, said Bonnet. Too sharp an angle to get a difference reading. Well, guess then. 1,800 feet. Hear anything behind us? Negative. Motors off, said Sparrow. Ramsey silenced the drive. Now, do you hear anything? Bonnet fussed with his instruments. Now do you hear anything? Bonnet fussed with his instruments. Negative. Full speed, said Sparrow. 2 degrees on the bow planes.
2 degrees on the bow planes, acknowledged Ramsey. He brought up the planes, eased in the drive, sent them surging upward.
1 degree left,
said Bonnet. Ramsey swung the helm. Sparrow looked at the pressure reading, 860 pounds. They were above 2,000 feet. Still the ram coursed upward. Half speed, said Sparrow. Ramsey brought back the throttle control to the mid-notch.
I can give you a rim reading, said Bonnet. About 90 fathoms.
540 feet, translated Sparrow. Are you sure of that sill depth? Bonnet rechecked his instruments.
Reasonably sure. I can give you a better reading in a minute.
Again Sparrow looked to the pressure gauge. 600 pounds. Make it 80 fathoms, said Bonnet. I was getting angular distortion.
Oh, wait. Make it 80 fathoms, said Bonnet. I was getting angular distortion.
480 feet, said Sparrow. Less than 1,000 to go. Quarter speed, if you please. Again Ramsey brought the throttle bar back a full notch. Hear anything, Les?
Negative.
The pressure gauge climbed past 400 pounds to the square inch, above 1,000 foot depth.
I make that canyon rim in 460 feet of water, said Bonnet.
Anything on the phones yet?
Still quiet.
Give us full power until we reach maximum speed, said Sparrow. Then shut everything down and coast up onto the rim. Set us down gently as you can. Ramsey's eyes widened. Now, said Sparrow. Ramsey shot the throttle forward. The subtug leaped ahead. They watched the pit log sweep through 23 knots. Now, barked Sparrow. Ramsey killed the drive, freed the induction system to allow the propeller to spin free. He jockeyed the planes to keep them on an even keel with the least drag.
We're over, said Bonnet.
Ramsey watched the pit log, began counting off the time over distance until he was certain the tow had cleared. Then he brought the bow planes down. They grounded in mud with almost no headway.
I'm hearing them, Skipper, said Bonnet. About 10 miles behind us and to the...
What's wrong?
Lost 'em.
They've gone into the gut after us, said Ramsey. Lift us, said Sparrow. Force speed. Ramsey jerked into motion, fed power into the drive, eased them off the bottom, pushed the throttle to the final notch. Sparrow watched the time log. 5 minutes. Kill the drive.
Still silent, said Bonnet.
5 minutes more, said Sparrow. Ramsey again sent them shooting ahead. 5 minutes. Drift and listen. 5 minutes. Drift and listen. 5 minutes. Drift and listen. Set us into the mud again, Johnny. The ram slanted down, grounded on a ripple surface of black manganese pebbles.
We've come 8 miles from the gut, said Bonnet.
He looked at the pressure gauge, 300 pounds.
It's only 700 feet deep here.
What do we care? Asked Ramsey. They think we're in that slot. They'll be scraping the bottom of it. Sparrow said, and there goes the whole shooting match. Ramsey looked at him sharply. What do you mean? They spotted us too close to target, and right on the trail leading to the well. How do they know it wasn't a feint?
No, they know we were hiding. They know. He fell silent. You mean we're going to slink home empty-handed? It was Bonnet, voice bitter. I wouldn't give them the satisfaction. The voice came from the aft door. Garcia. The three in the control room whirled. Garcia stepped fully onto the control deck. We've got to thumb our noses at them, Skipper. How long have you been there? Asked Sparrow. Garcia frowned. Maybe 10 minutes. I heard the shift in speed and felt. He broke off. Skipper, we've come too far to. Relax, said Sparrow. We're going through. How? We're going to sit here. How long? Asked Ramsey. Maybe a day, maybe longer, until they get tired of looking or decide they've missed us. But they're sure to leave a stakeout around here on just that chance, protested Bonnet. Let's pray that they do, said Sparrow. Les, take over the controls and stand by search. Johnny, you and Joe come with me. Sparrow led the way across to the chartboard. He swept his earlier work aside, pulled out a fresh sheet of scratch paper, began drawing cyclic curves across it. He took a second sheet, repeated the performance. Ramsey watched, puzzled. Garcia bent close to the work. Presently Sparrow straightened. What do I have here, Johnny? It could be a sonic curve, but it's the modulated beat of one of our A2 fish. Oh, whoops. It's the modulated beat of one of our A2 fish, said Garcia. Sparrow nodded. Now watch this. He lifted one of the sheets, placed it over the other, held both to a light, and adjusted them. He clipped the sheets together, still holding them up to the light, began to draw a new freehand curve, a broken scrawl on the surface. That's rough, he said, but it gives the idea. A silencer-damped screw beat from the ram, said Ramsey. Two of our A2 fish hooked in tandem and their screws set to resonate, said Sparrow. It might fool an EP until he got close enough to detect the difference in mass, said Ramsey. Sparrow nodded. And what if our pair of fish carried a scrambler set to go off before they could detect mass difference? Ramsey stepped back from the board, stared at Sparrow. These are shallow waters, he said. The EPs would blanket the distortion area and flood it with seeker fish and they'd get a very satisfactory explosion, said Sparrow. This is all very well, but how are we going to rig our fish out there when we're in 700 feet of water and unable to start our engines? Asked Garcia. We've a perfect stabilizer, said Sparrow. The slug. We bleed air into our tanks until we gain enough buoyance to lift, then we pay out tow line until we reach 300 feet where we can go outside and do our work. The slug anchors us. Balance on the 4 points of the tow lines, muttered Garcia. It'll bloody well work. It will. He looked up at Sparrow. Skipper, you're a genius. Can you rig those fish? Can you two rig those fish to fake the sound of our screw? Asked Sparrow. Ramsey grinned. Just let us out there. One more thing, said Sparrow. I'll want you to alter the drive speed controls like this. Again he bent over the chartboard, scribbling on the scratch pad. Ramsey shook his head. Just a minute, Skipper. Sparrow stopped, looked up at Ramsey. The electronics officer took the pencil from Sparrow's hand. To the devil with speed only. That's too complicated. What you want is a sound variation. First, the sound of a Helldiver subtug under quarter speed, then half speed, and then full speed to simulate flight. He sketched in a series of matched harmonics. We'll just change the resonating factor and... The adjustments to change resonance won't give it much increase in speed, said Garcia. It'll be enough, said Sparrow. They won't be looking for refinements. Johnny's plan is simpler, less likely to break down. He put a hand on the sketch pad. Can you two do it? Garcia nodded. Get us up there. Sparrow turned back to the control board, strode across to Bonnet. "You hear that, Les?" "Enough to get the idea." He tilted his head toward the search board. "Still no sounds of those boys."
"Let's hope they run right up onto Novaya Zemlya," said Sparrow.
Bleh.
"Let's hope they run right up onto Novaya Zemlya," said Sparrow. "Give us a 0.5% buoyancy in the bow tank."
Bonnet stepped to his left, turned a valve wheel a fraction of a degree, watched a dial above it, closed the valve.
"Joe, play us up on the wow. Joe, play us up on the tow lines," said Sparrow.
Garcia moved to the tow controls, released the magnetics clutch on the big master reel. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the ram lifted off the bottom, slid upward. They watched the static pressure gauge climb through 200 pounds to the square inch. 180, 160, 140.
"Slow us down," ordered Sparrow.
Garcia fed a little power into the magnetic brakes. 130, 120, 115.
"Snub us,"
ordered Sparrow. The needle stopped on 110 pounds.
"That's close enough to 250 feet," said Sparrow. "Joe, Johnny, this is your show."
Garcia secured the tow board. "Better watch the balance on these lines," he said. "If the current shifts—"
"That's our worry," said Sparrow. "I'd blow tanks before I'd pull you two down into the high pressure."
Garcia smiled wanly. "Sorry, Skipper. You know how I feel about—"
"You've a good electronics man with you," said Sparrow.
He nodded toward Ramsey, looked significantly at Garcia. "I'm with you, Bleh. Give me a sec. "I'm with you, Skipper," said Garcia. Ramsey thought, why doesn't he just say, "Keep an eye on this suspicious character"? He looked at Garcia. "You afraid of the water?" Garcia's dark features paled.
"That will be enough," said Sparrow. "You've a job to do."
Ramsey shrugged. "Let's go swimming," he said, turned toward the forward door, and led the way out onto the engine room catwalk, up to the ladder to the escape hatch. The sea suits and aqualungs were in a slide locker beside the hatch. Ramsey yanked one set out, stepped aside for Garcia, fitted himself for the sea. Finished, he undogged the hatch, climbed inside, and leaned against the ring rail. Garcia followed, checked his mouthpiece, pulled it aside, and glared at Ramsey. "Somewhere, some day, someone is going to thump your head for you, you head thumper." Ramsey stared at the engineering officer. "What are you— You psycho boys are all alike," said Garcia. "You think you're the custodians of deep, dark knowledge. Soul custodians." "I don't—" "Come off that," said Garcia. "But I thought you—" "Yes?" Garcia grinned at him, a mirthless expression. "Well, You thought I had you pegged for a spy, a jolly old sleeper," said Garcia. He shook his head. "None such. I'm quite certain you're not." "What gives you the idea I'm a psych man?" "We're wasting time," said Garcia. He jammed his mouthpiece into place, pulled up the hatch, and dogged it. Ramsey put the cold rubber of the mouthpiece between his teeth, tested the air. It tasted of chemicals, bitter. Garcia spun the sea valve. Cold water rushed in around them, spewing upward onto the circular walls, whirling in swift currents. A kick of fin flippers took Ramsey to the open hatch. Outside was utter blackness, broken only by the glow from the escape compartment and the small hand lamp carried by Garcia. The long Arctic night on the surface and the cover of water conspired to create an utter absence of light. In spite of the reflecting layers of his sea suit, Ramsey could feel the chill of the water begin to bite into him. Garcia held to the hatch guard with one hand as he rigged a safety line onto his belt. The hand lamp clipped to his waist pointed down toward the waist rack of torpedoes. Thin, deadly shapes stuck through the metal guide slots like bullets in a belt. Ramsey fastened his own belt clip to the safety line. Garcia pointed his hand lamp back into the hatchway, indicated another line snaking out of the green gloom of the escape compartment. Ramsey pulled on the line, brought out a toolkit. A current caught at Ramsey, pulled him away from the hatch. He was snubbed short by the safety line, swam back and caught up the kit. Garcia kicked off the hull, swam down toward the torpedo rack. Ramsey turned for one look upward toward the night-cloaked surface, followed. The engineering officer stopped at a torpedo low down on the rack, keeping well clear of the finned arming rotor on the torpedo's nose. Yellow stripes behind the arming rotor identified it as a short-range, low-blast model for infighting. Row on row of the deadly metal fish extended upward around the ram's waist. Garcia patted the torpedo, looked at Ramsey. Ramsey shook his head, pointed to the one below it. Pointed to one below it. Red stripes, a long-range seeker. Garcia nodded. They dropped down to the torpedo, cautiously disarmed it. Ramsey noted the number. 14. Pointed to it. Garcia nodded. Ramsey unhinged the side plate, motioned for the light. Its beams shone into the torpedo. He had already figured out the changes necessary. Disconnect the seeker circuit, reset for level course, drive timer coupling racked back to new control order, 400 revolutions, 600, 800. He forgot to worry about Garcia in the concentration of work. Presently, it was done. They dropped down to another torpedo of the same model, repeated the changes except for the calculated resonance factor. Then it was time to disconnect the upper torpedo, lower it down beside the second, link the two carefully with swivel bolts. Below the altered torpedoes, Ramsey sought out the solid yellow and red nose of a scrambler model, inserted the seeker capsule from the first unit they had changed. He tied this torpedo to the other two with a length of light cable. Toward the last, he found himself working in less and less light. He seated the final cable clamp, looked up the hull. Garcia floated high along the rack. Now he was swimming toward the escape compartment. Swimming fast. The sea's darkness swept down around Ramsey. Is he going to trap me out here? Close the hatch against me? Panic washed over him. He flailed the fin flippers, swept up toward the receding light. Garcia could wait in the compartment until he was almost out of air, knowing I'd be in the same fix. Then he could go inside to safety. I'd drown before they could come back out. He'd have a plausible story about me disappearing. Garcia's light sank into the escape compartment, leaving the darkness behind. I'm not going to make it. The safety line abruptly snubbed him up short. Ramsey tugged at it, fouled on something. He fought the belt connection, freed it, resumed his flailing progress toward the hatch, a faint glow from Garcia's light against the blackness. Now he was over the hatch. Ramsey grabbed the rail, felt a hand take his, pull him inside. Garcia! Ramsey felt a wave of relief. The light in the compartment showed that Garcia had been reeling in the safety line. It stretched taut between reel and hatch. The snag. Garcia pointed toward the hatch. He wants me to go out and free it, thought Ramsey. He shook his head. Again, Garcia pointed toward the hatch. Again, Ramsey shook his head. Garcia hesitated, then swung up the line and out the hatch, taking the portable light with him. Presently he returned, and the line sagged. He reeled it onto its drum, sealed the outside hatch. Ramsey opened the high-pressure air valve, The water level began to lower. When it reached their shoulders, they unhooked the face connections of the aqualungs. Garcia's mouth held a subtle hint of amusement. He knows he frightened me, thought Ramsay. He did it deliberately. The last of the water swished out of the seacock. Seacock? Not lock? Garcia undogged the inner hatch, led the way out onto the upper catwalk of the engine room. Silently, they stripped the suits from their bodies, returned to the control deck. Sparrow met them at the door. "Well?" "All done," said Garcia. 14 is linked to 22. They'll both fire on 22's stud. They'll seek a northerly course and hold about 10 fathoms off bottom." Sparrow looked at Ramsay, who nodded. The skipper turned back to Garcia. "Run into any trouble?" "Johnny's the electronics man. He did all the work." Sparrow turned to Ramsay. "It was fairly easy." Garcia said, "Johnny's safety line snagged on the way in, but I freed it. Outside of that, it was a quiet swim." "All quiet in here, too," said Sparrow. He nodded toward a cot on the far side of the control room. Bonnet stretched out on it. "Les is getting some shut-eye. You two had better do the same. We're going to sit here for a while." "Right-o," said Garcia. "The swim made me tired. Let's go, Johnny boy." He ducked through the door, went down the companionway, Ramsay following. Garcia stopped at the door of his room, turned and smiled at Ramsay. "Pleasant dreams, head thumper." Ramsay brushed past him into his own room, locked the door behind him, and leaned against it. He could feel his heart thumping heavily. Damn that man! He fought himself into a semblance of calmness, went to the telemeter box, examined the new lengths of tape. Sparrow was still locked in icy control. Ramsay reset the box, turned off his lights, fell into his bunk and into a restless sleep. It seemed that he had just closed his eyes when he was aroused by the buzzer. Surrounded? Aroused by the buzzer. He got up stiffly, went forward to the control deck. The others were already there. Take over the search board," said Sparrow. "Oh my God. What's that? I'm sorry." "Take over the search board," said Sparrow. He waited for Ramsay to comply, depressed the firing board stud at number 22. Immediately, Ramsay picked up the beat of it on his instruments. He felt Sparrow move into position beside him. Together they stared at the scope. "Good job," said Sparrow. "Looks just like our pip." Ramsay rotated the outside bell detector of the ranging system. "No sign of a stakeout," he said. "That would be a bitter one," said Garcia. "All of our yeoman efforts out there have gone for naught. I'd almost "There he is," said Ramsay. "Northeast and coming fast." "Interception course." "And there's the first speed increase in our decoy," said Ramsay. Couldn't have been better timing," said Bonnet. "Another signal to the west," said Ramsay. "Our stakeout has called his pals." "And there's full speed simulation," said Sparrow. "Wonderful job, Johnny." And they waited, watching the signals merge. Abruptly, the instruments gyrated wildly as the decoy's scrambler system was activated. Again they waited. A distant double thump resonated against the ram's hull, and simultaneously the scrambler signal stopped. "Now track every one of them," said Sparrow. "If those EPs all leave, we've made it." Ramsay watched the signals. Pack quartering over the explosion area. 4 departing. He waited. 2 more. Courses southwest. There go the last ones. He tracked them until they went off his instruments, turned with a triumphant smile and looked at Sparrow. "Just as you planned it, Skipper." "Hmm, yes." He turned away. "We'll wait here for another 4 hours before going into the well area."
Chapter 12. The ram crept up the fissure at quarter speed, lifted out in 600 feet of water, and slid up slope like a giant fish seeking its dinner in the bottom mud. Inside, Sparrow stood at the helm, Garcia with him. "Here's the ledge," said Sparrow. He nodded toward the screen above them. It showed a pie slice of illumination cut from the dark waters by the bow lights. A rocky outcropping. "Shall I call the others?" asked Garcia. "Yes." Garcia pressed the call button. Ramsey acknowledged from the electronics shack. "What are you doing in the electronics shack?" asked Sparrow. "I couldn't rest, so I—" My orders that we were to work only in double teams didn't interest you?" "Skipper, I had an idea about—" "Just a moment." Sparrow pointed to the screen above him, a starfish-shaped mound. "Right on, Joe." He disengaged the drive, drifted up on the mound, past it, grounded. 205 pounds even, Skipper." Sparrow nodded, plugged in the side eyes, examined the bottom. "Plenty of mud for ballast." Bonnet entered. "Skipper, are we—" "We've arrived," said Sparrow. "Les, will you go aft to the shack and check on Johnny?"
Isn't he—"
"He's been in the shack for some time. Alone." Bonnet whirled around, disappeared down the companionway. "I will not be responsible for revealing the site of this well," said Sparrow. "What do you mean?" asked Garcia. "You don't think I—" Sparrow froze him with a look. "Mr. Garcia, we've been shipmates since you were chief machinist and I was a dryback ensign. But right now I wouldn't trust you as far as I could see you. One of security's men was trapped and killed aboard my ship. The EP's got spy beams aboard us. Someone did it. Do I make myself clear?"
"Yes, sir."
Garcia turned back to the searchboard. In the electronics shack, Ramsey held up the tube on which he had been working. "This has to be how they set off their spy beam," he thought, "and it means they could have another one ready to go any second." His hand trembled as he reached out to plug the tube into a test socket. The hand was abruptly knocked aside and a fist crashed into the side of his jaw.
"You dirty spying bastard!"
growled Bonnet. Again his fist crashed into Ramsey's jaw. Ramsey, bent backward over the bench, tried to dodge aside.
"Les, wait! I—" "Gonna save us the price of a trial,"
gritted Bonnet. He crashed an elbow into Ramsey's mouth, lifted a knee into the groin. "My God, he means to kill me!" thought Ramsey. He fought back desperately, chopping an arm at Bonnet's throat. Nausea from the groin blow clutched him. Bonnet dodged Ramsey's blow, sent another fist into the electronics officer's mouth.
"For God's sake!" screamed Ramsey. "I'm no spy!" "You dirty, lying, sneaking—"
Bonnet stepped back, chopped the side of his hand into the curve of Ramsey's neck, sent a fist crashing into Ramsey's jaw. Ramsey felt himself going blank, waved his arms futilely in front of him. Let's try that sentence again. Ramsey felt himself going blank, waved his arms futilely in front of him. Something crashed against the side of his head. He felt a sledgehammer blow over his heart and blacked out. Voices. They came to Ramsey from somewhere at the top of a long, black hole. He tried to ignore them, moved his head. Pain shot through him. "I think he's coming around." Garcia. "Here, make him drink this." Sparrow.
"Why waste it?"
Bonnet. "I'm not satisfied that you're correct." Sparrow.
"I tell you, Skipper, I saw him putting that spy beam tube into a socket and—"
"How do you know it was a spy beam? One of you stepped on it and crushed it during the fracas."
"It looked damn suspicious, Skipper."
"Looked schmooked." Garcia. Hand under his neck. Something acid and biting in his mouth, burning his throat. Choking, coughing.
Ramsay gagged, retched. Again the liquid was forced past his lips. He shuddered, managed to keep it down. His body felt like one large ache. Can you talk, Johnny? Sparrow. Ramsay opened his eyes. Sparrow bent over him, supporting his shoulders. Bonnet and Garcia stood beyond. Ramsay's eyes focused on the rest of his surroundings. Rec room, cot, table, and first aid kit. Back to Bonnet and Garcia. Bonnet glowering, perhaps a bit uncertain. Garcia faintly worried. Ramsay groped toward his jaw with one hand, felt a lance of fire shoot through his head. I can talk a little, he said. Sparrow brought some pillows up behind Ramsay, eased him back onto them. What were you doing in the shack? The tube. Spy beam. Ramsay forced the words past his thickened lips. Think I found out how spy beam triggered. Sudden interest in the eyes of Sparrow and Garcia. More uncertainty in Bonnet's expression. By someone on board? Asked Sparrow. No. This is urgent, Skipper. Don't raise the parabox. Why? Piping in a signal. The air's full of stuff. What? This is special. You gave me idea. Ramsay passed his tongue over his thickened lips, forced himself to speak clearly. Gotta understand me, he said. Resonance. EPs are sending out a harmonic on the plate frequency of our L4 tubes. Eventually, it breaks them down so they become microphonic. The tubes we found were just amplifiers. Spy beam actually comes from the L4s. But if we've taken out all the amplifiers, enough L4s sending and they'd interact in feedback, said Garcia. Wouldn't need an amplifier. They'd set up a howl that could be heard anywhere. Why the Perry box? Asked Sparrow. Then he said, Of course. They'd have to get a clear, strong signal into us, and the Parabox is the only road that isn't damped by a plasteel hull. He shook his head. Granting that you're telling the truth, granted that you're telling the truth. Oh my gosh. He shook his head. Granting that you're telling the truth and that this is so, how can Rig a substitute for the L4s, said Garcia. That's the weak spot in the system. That's what I was testing when Les jumped me, said Ramsay. Bonnet scowled. This could be a trick, Skipper. Garcia said. Can it, Les? Damn it all! Shouted Bonnet. Yesterday you were both telling me how suspicious. We'll discuss it another time, said Sparrow. He turned to Garcia. What do you think, Joe? It sounds right, Skipper. Garcia held up a hand, ticked off items on his fingers. It has the advantage of simplicity. All they'd have to know is the plate frequency factor of a suitable tube, and they could channel all their efforts toward breaking down that one unit. If the actual signal originates with them and is merely rebroadcast from our system, they'd have the essential elements of a sonoran system, pinpoint accuracy in locating us. And what would be harder to detect? Their broadcast would be a constant sound in the ether, so every time we raised our peribox, our bold filters would automatically cut out that signal as non-dangerous, and we wouldn't be listening at all on the wavelength that would be likely to give us away. Let's try that paragraph again, where I don't mangle the cadence. My bad. It sounds right, Skipper. Garcia held up a hand, ticked off items on his fingers. It has the advantage of simplicity. All they'd have to know is the plate frequency factor of a suitable tube, and they could channel all their efforts toward breaking down that one unit. If the actual signal originates with them and is merely rebroadcast from our system, they'd have the essential elements of a sonoran system, pinpoint accuracy in locating us. And what would be harder to detect? Their broadcast would be a constant sound in the ether, so every time we raised our peribox, our board filters would automatically cut out that signal as non-dangerous, and we wouldn't be listening at all on the wavelength that would be likely to give us away. Even Bonnet was nodding in agreement as Garcia finished. Garcia looked at Ramsey. Is that the way you had it figured? Yes. I could probably figure out a substitute system to eliminate the L4s, said Garcia, but you're the electronics expert. How? Schematic on shack workbench, said Ramsey.
Les, check that, ordered Sparrow. If it's true, it's one more item to confirm his story.
Bonnet went out the door. Ramsey shut his eyes, tried to slide off the pillows and stretch out flat on the cot.
Better not, said Sparrow. He held Ramsey upright. Joe, steady him here a moment while I look at that nose.
Garcia held Ramsey's shoulders. Sparrow touched Ramsey's nose gently. Ouch! Ramsey jerked back.
Doesn't appear to be broken,
said Sparrow. He reached out, put a thumb on Ramsey's left eyelid, held up the lid while he flashed a hand light into the eye.
Maybe a slight concussion.
How long was I out? Asked Ramsey.
About an hour, said Ramsey. You...
Bonnet entered, carrying a grease-stained sheet of notepaper. He passed the paper to Garcia, who removed one hand from Ramsey's shoulder to take the paper.
What do you say, Joe?
Asked Sparrow. Garcia studied the paper silently, nodded once, passed it to Sparrow. A clever adaptation. Simple. It'll work, and it uses a tube with a different plate frequency. What does this mean? Asked Bonnet. It means you batted out, old chap, said Garcia. In the vernacular, you goofed. Bonnet's voice was dangerously low. Is that so? As a matter of honest fact, we've all goofed, said Garcia. You were the overt instrument of our dereliction. Bonnet looked down at Ramsey. If I made a mistake, I apologize. He glanced at Sparrow, who was still studying Ramsey's schematic diagram. But I reserve the right to my own opinion. Sparrow straightened from beside Ramsey's bunk, looked at Garcia.
Keep him awake for a couple of hours, Joe.
He turned away.
Come along, Les. We've a slug to fill and some tube jockeying. No time to waste.
Do you want me to do the electronics work? Asked Garcia.
You stick with him,
said Sparrow. He pushed in the doorway, stared speculatively at Ramsey, turned and left, followed by Bonnet. Do you think they could break down those L4s without piping through the peribox? Asked Garcia. In time, said Ramsey, but they'd have to increase signal strength by several factors to get a return signal unamplified unless our box were on the surface. Clever devils, muttered Garcia. How'd you spot it? Skipper gave me the idea with his scheme for faking the sound of our screw. Got you thinking about resonance, said Garcia. About building signals with harmonics, corrected Ramsey. Same thing. Garcia came around in front of Ramsey. Boy, he really worked you over. I guess he did. Your own fault, though. Ramsey jerked his head up to stare at Garcia, winced at the sudden motion. Why do you say that? For some reason, you've deliberately set us out to make the skipper suspicious of you. Whoops. For some reason, you've deliberately set out to make the skipper suspicious of you. But you forgot one thing. Suspicion is contagious. The pressure's cooking your brains, said Ramsey. I wish I knew what you were trying to prove, said Garcia. Maybe you're trying to beach the skipper. Nuts! You have too much imagination. We're like there, Johnny, and time drags in a sub-tug. There's time for a good imagination to run wild. He stared at the bulkhead a moment. That's the skipper's problem, too, really. That's a rare piece of insight, said Ramsey. Garcia acted as though he had not heard. Imagination is a weakness when too much responsibility hangs on your shoulders. They felt the ram move, stop. We're seating the pump onto that well cap, said Garcia. It'll take us a couple of days to fill the slug, then home we go.
If it were only that easy, said Ramsay.
Garcia turned, strode across to the rec room bookshelf, found a book, searched in it for a moment, and brought it back to Ramsay. I think you'd better read this, Johnny. It's Savvy Sparrow's favorite passage. He handed Ramsay a Bible, pointing to the beginning of a chapter, said, Isaiah 27, 1 and 2. Ramsay read it through silently, then reread it aloud. In that day the Lord with his sore and great and strong sword. What? With his sore and great and strong sword shall punish Leviathan the piercing serpent, even Leviathan that crooked serpent, and he shall slay the dragon that is in the sea. Garcia continued the quotation from memory. In that day sing ye unto her a vineyard of red wine. Ramsay stared at the passage, shook his head. What's it mean to him? Garcia said, And he shall slay the dragon that is in the sea. He reached down, took back the Bible. To Savvy Sparrow, we're the dragon in the sea.
Oh my god, it's the title.
Here, let me have that, said Ramsay. He took back the Bible. Think I'll read for a while. Look out, or you'll get religion, said Garcia. No chance, said Ramsay. My teachers always said if you want to understand a subject, study the basic source. This is for our captain. This is it for our captain. For a great many people, said Garcia softly, and a psychologist who does not have an intimate knowledge of that book is a doctor without instruments, and blind to boot. Ramsay looked at Garcia over the top of the book. When are you going to give up that line? When you wake up, said Garcia. Ramsay hid a frown behind the Bible, opened it again to the passage Garcia had pointed out, soon lost himself in the fury of Isaiah, and the woe of Hezekiah, and the thundering messages of prophecy. In the cold Arctic waters outside the ram, pumps turned, hose nozzles sought out bottom muck for ballast. The plastic slug began to swell with its cargo of oil, like a live thing drinking at a jugular in the earth. The hands of the time log swept around, around. 51 hours at the well.
And that will do it for today. About an hour and a half, yeah, a little under. Um, hope people dug it. Probably two more streams, 2 more weeks of this. And where does that put us date wise? That puts us on the 16th. Okay, good. Yikes. That gives me 2 weeks, and then I'm gone the next weekend. October 7th. October a month, basically. Yeah, October 6th, 7th, 8th. I'm not around. I'll figure out what I'm doing for that. I'll try to measure things out properly. Maybe I'll do 2 streams worth of short stories, and then on the next one, I'll get started doing my next novel project, which I'm thinking at this point is going to be Starfish. Um, oh, it's a work weekend. Well, it's a work half week. I have to go out of state to do some work on a server farm. Fun stuff. Fun stuff. But that's not for another month, so I don't have to worry about that when I'm just looking ahead. Alrighty, so yeah, hope people dug it. That was from Under Pressure or The Dragon in the Sea, and we just learned why it's called The Dragon in the Sea. We got the line. He said the thing. By Frank Herbert. And yeah, if you like that, I do it every Friday. I do this every Friday, starting at about noon Eastern Standard Time. So go on to your time and date chart, wherever that is, and find out what that is for you in your region. If you're watching it live, like Mr. Optical Antenna is doing, yes, I don't actually know. Optical, like optical antenna is doing. Um, awesome, you're watching me live. If you're watching this on YouTube, which I think is infinitely more likely, again, those are the times when I'm generally doing this. I've been relatively consistent for ever since I swapped off of doing Storytime Saturdays. Originally, it was a Friday stream, then I had to switch it to Saturdays because of scheduling constraints, and now it's been Fridays for a while now. So that should remain consistent. I do other streams throughout the week. I've got a Mecha Monday stream where I do something giant robot related or mecha adjacent. I've got a Warframe Wednesdays stream where I do Warframe for a couple hours, and then this Free Read Fridays where I read short stories and indeed entire novels aloud. Hope to see you all next time. Thanks for tuning in. Stay safe, stay sane, and be decent to each other. As for my bit, it is a gorgeous day, so I'm going to go out and take a walk. All right, see you all later. Bye.